The first time Opal Rhodes pointed a rifle at a stranger, her hands did not shake, and that told her everything she needed to know about what 7 years of widowhood had made her into. It was the spring of 1882, and the Kansas plains stretched out around her homestead like a vast, indifferent sea, the kind of country that swallowed men whole and never offered up their bones. Opal stood on her porch in the gray light before dawn, the Winchester her late husband Emmett had left behind pressed to her shoulder, her left eye shut, her right eye steady and cold as river stone. The man at the end of her barrel was a stranger on a roan horse, and he had made the considerable mistake of riding up her lane at 4 in the morning without calling out. "State your name and your business," Opal said, "or state your prayers. Either way, you have about 3 seconds." The man on the horse raised both hands with a slowness that suggested he had had rifles pointed at him before and had learned not to make sudden movements. He was broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas duster that had seen better decades, and beneath the brim of a battered hat his face was all hard angles and a jaw that could have been used to split wood. "Clarence Stone," he said. "I am looking for the Rhodes farm. I was told it was on this road." "You found it," Opal said, not lowering the rifle. "That answers one question. You still owe me the second." "I was hired by Frank Bellamy over in Dodge to deliver a letter and a package to Mrs. Opal Rhodes," the man said. "I would show you the letter to prove it, but I would rather not reach into my coat with a Winchester aimed at my chest, if that is all the same to you." Opal considered this for a long moment. Behind her, inside the house, she heard the floorboards creak, one of the boys awakened by voices. She did not take her eyes off the stranger. "Ride forward slow," she said. "Keep your hands where I can see them. You reach for anything before I tell you to, and I will not miss." "I have no doubt of that," Clarence Stone said, and he nudged his horse forward. In the pale light of early morning he came into clearer focus, and Opal saw that he was perhaps 32 or 33 years old, with several days of dark stubble and eyes the color of weathered cedar. There was a quality to him that was difficult to name immediately, something careful and measured, the way a man moves when he is accustomed to being quiet in the world. He stopped his horse at the foot of the porch steps and waited, still with his hands raised. "Lower your left hand and take out the letter," Opal said. "Slowly." He did exactly as instructed, producing an envelope from inside his coat with 2 careful fingers and holding it out toward her. She came down 1 step and took it without ever letting the barrel drift from center mass. She was good at this. 7 years of being the only thing standing between her boys and a world full of men who thought a widow's property was an invitation had made her very good at this. She glanced at the envelope without fully looking away from him. It was addressed in Frank Bellamy's cramped handwriting, and it bore the wax seal she recognized from her late husband's business dealings with the man. She tucked it under her arm. "Get down," she said. "Tie your horse at the post. You can wait on the porch while I read this." "Yes, ma'am," Clarence Stone said, and the simplicity of his compliance, no argument, no injured pride, no attempt to assert himself, was the second thing she noticed about him. She stepped back inside and closed the screen door. In the kitchen, both of her sons were standing in the doorway in their nightshirts, their dark hair sleep-rumpled, their eyes wide and worried. Eli was 12 now, and had his father's square jaw and his mother's watchfulness. Thomas was 9, smaller and quicker, with a habit of thinking 3 steps ahead that sometimes unnerved even Opal. "Is there trouble, Mama?" Eli asked. "Not yet," Opal said, which was her standard answer. She lit the lamp on the kitchen table and broke the seal on the envelope. Frank Bellamy's letter was brief and businesslike, which was in keeping with the man. It informed her that Emmett's old business partner, a man named Howard Greer, had died intestate in Wichita, and that there was a question of a small parcel of land that had been jointly owned, which now had some legal bearing on the Rhodes property. Bellamy needed her signature on several documents and had sent the bearer of the letter, one Clarence Stone, as a trusted courier and escort should she wish to come to Dodge to handle the matter in person. There was also a package, Bellamy wrote, containing Emmett's personal effects that Howard Greer had been holding for reasons Bellamy could not explain in a letter. Opal read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and held it against her chest for a moment, because any mention of Emmett still had a weight to it even after 7 years, the way a healed-over wound still aches in cold weather. Emmett Rhodes had died in the spring of 1875, when Eli was 5 and Thomas was 2, killed by a fever that had come on fast and taken him inside of 4 days. He had been 31 years old and had not yet become the man Opal had believed he was going to become, and she had spent a long time grieving not just the man but the future that died with him. Then she had stopped grieving and started working, because the land did not care about her grief and her sons were hungry. She went back to the screen door. The man named Clarence Stone was sitting on the top porch step with his hat in his hands, looking out at the dark plain. He did not look up when she pushed the door open, though he certainly heard her. "I have read the letter," Opal said. "I have some questions." "I expect you do," he said. She sat down in Emmett's old chair, the one she had never been able to bring herself to move from the porch, and set the rifle across her knees. Not threatening exactly, just present. "How do you know Frank Bellamy?" "I have done courier work for him before. Twice, maybe 3 times over the past 2 years. He is a fair man who pays what he says he will pay." "Are you a lawman?" "I have been," he said. "I was a deputy in Ford County for 4 years. I am not anymore." "Why not?" He turned the hat in his hands. It was a contemplative gesture, not an evasive one. "The man I worked for developed political interests that I did not share. There were things he wanted done that I was not willing to do, so I left." Opal studied him. She had spent 7 years reading men the way other people read weather, looking for signs of the storm beneath the surface, and what she read in Clarence Stone was not nothing, but it was not what she usually found either. Most men who came to her door alone and unannounced were carrying some flavor of want of the land, want of the livestock, want of the widow herself. This man seemed to be carrying something else entirely, something more like tiredness. "You rode through the night," she said. "I did." "Why, Dodge is 2 days' ride. You could have stopped." "I could have," he agreed, "but I wanted to get here before the next riders did." Opal went very still. "What next riders?" Clarence turned to look at her then, and in the lamplight spilling through the screen door she could see his eyes clearly for the first time. They were the kind of eyes that had seen things they could not unsee and had made some kind of peace with that. "There is a man named Dale Cutler," he said carefully. "He has been buying up land along this road for the past 18 months. When I stopped in Larne 2 days ago, I heard he had sent men to look at this property. I do not know what he intends, but I thought you ought to know before anyone arrived on your doorstep with papers." Opal felt the familiar cold gather in her chest, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, the kind of alertness that had kept her and her sons alive for 7 years. "I know the name Cutler," she said. "He bought the Harmon place last year, and the old Tesler homestead." "Yes," Clarence said, "and 3 others between here and the creek." The silence between them was occupied by the sound of the wind moving through the grass and the distant call of a night bird that had not yet gotten the news about morning. "Why are you telling me this?" Opal asked. "You were paid to deliver a letter and a package." Clarence Stone was quiet for a moment. "Because it seemed like something you ought to know," he said finally. "And because I passed by your fence line on the way in, and it is clear you have worked very hard for what you have here, it seemed wrong not to say something." Opal looked at him for a long time. He looked back at her without pretense or performance, and she thought that this was the most honest conversation she had had with a man she did not know since Emmett died. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "I will make a decision about Dodge in the morning." "That is very generous," he said. "It is not generous. The barn has a loft and it is warmer than the ground. I am being practical." She stood up and lifted the rifle. "Do not go into the house, do not go near the well without asking first, and do not talk to my boys unless they speak to you first. Those are my terms." "Understood," Clarence said, and stood as well, and Opal noticed for the first time that he was quite tall, though he carried his height in the same careful, understated way he seemed to carry everything else. She showed him where the water bucket was and where the barn door stuck, and then she went back inside and stood in her kitchen for a long while after, listening to the sounds of a man settling into her barn for the first time in 7 years. In the morning, the package arrived. Opal had been up since before light, as she always was, starting the fire and setting water to boil and thinking about Dale Cutler and his pattern of acquisition, and what it might mean for the 160 acres she had spent 7 years of her life breaking and tending and refusing to surrender. She heard Clarence in the yard. He had apparently risen even earlier than she had, and she watched through the kitchen window as he worked the pump handle and washed his face in the cold water with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who expected nothing from the morning but what he made of it. She was putting biscuits in the oven when Eli came downstairs and looked out the window. "He is still here," Eli observed, with the particular careful tone of a 12-year-old boy who had learned to be watchful. "He is," Opal said. "Is he staying?" "I do not know yet." Eli considered this. He was quiet in the way she had taught him to be, measuring things before he spoke. Thomas was the opposite. He arrived in the kitchen at a dead run 2 minutes later and immediately went to the window and pressed his face against it. "Is that the man from last night?" Thomas demanded. "The one you were going to shoot?" "I was not going to shoot him," Opal said. "I was making a determination." "You had the rifle aimed right at him," Thomas said with some admiration. "Thomas." "Yes, Mama. Go wash your face." Thomas went, but not without looking back twice. Opal set the table and called Clarence in from the yard, because it would have been uncivilized to make a man who had ridden through the night eat biscuits in a barn, and Opal Rhodes, whatever else she had become, was not uncivilized. He came in and took off his hat at the door without being reminded, and he sat in the chair she indicated and said thank you when she set coffee in front of him, and both of these things were noted, though she made no show of noting them. Thomas stared at him across the table with open and unsubtle curiosity. Clarence bore this examination with what appeared to be genuine equanimity. "What is your name?" Thomas asked. "Thomas," Opal said. "He can answer if he wants to," Thomas said reasonably. "My name is Clarence Stone," the man said. "What is yours?" "Thomas Rhodes. I am 9. My brother is Eli. He is 12. He is over there." Thomas gestured at Eli, who was sitting at the far end of the table pretending to read. "Hello, Eli," Clarence said. Eli looked up. "Hello," he said, with a wariness that was years beyond his age. After breakfast, Clarence produced the package from his saddlebag. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, and it was smaller than Opal had expected, about the size of a large book. He set it on the table and pushed it toward her without ceremony. She cut the twine with her kitchen knife and unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small wooden box. Inside the box was Emmett's pocket watch, the one she had thought was lost, and a folded letter in Emmett's handwriting, and a small tintype photograph of Emmett as a young man, maybe 19 or 20, standing in front of a building she did not recognize, grinning at the camera with the whole bright, uncomplicated future in front of him. Opal sat with these objects for a long time. She was aware that Clarence had quietly stood up from the table and taken his coffee cup to the window, giving her the distance of the room without leaving it, and she was aware of Eli and Thomas watching her with the particular attention of children who understood that their mother's grief was a private country they were not always permitted to enter. "He kept these things," she said, "not to anyone in particular." "Mr. Greer's letter said they were left to him for safekeeping," Clarence said, still at the window, still looking out. Opal nodded. She folded Emmett's letter without reading it yet and put everything back in the box. Later. She would read it later when the boys were asleep and the house was quiet and she could give the grief its proper space without witnesses. "I will go to Dodge," she said, "but I cannot leave the property unattended. If Cutler's men are already looking at this land, I need someone here while I am gone." "I can stay," Eli said immediately. "You cannot," Opal said. "You are 12 years old." "I can shoot." "That is not the point." She looked at Clarence. Is there any chance that Frank Bellamy could send the papers here, rather than requiring me to come to him? Clarence thought about it. I believe so. The matter is not so urgent that it cannot wait for papers to travel. If I ride back today, I could have them to you within the week. But Opal was already thinking past that. She was thinking about Dale Cutler and what she knew of him, which was not much but was enough. He was a man who used lawyers and surveyors and the machinery of the law to do what men used to do with threats and guns, and in some ways that made him more dangerous than the older kind. A man with a rifle you could see. A man with lawyers worked invisibly in offices with ink. I think I need to come myself, she said. I think I need to understand what papers are being signed and what they mean for the land. She paused. And I think I need to bring the boys. Eli straightened. Thomas made a sound of pure excitement. Opal held up one hand. This is not a pleasure trip. You will behave yourselves, you will stay close, and you will do exactly as I say without argument or discussion. Yes, Mama, both boys said, in the synchronized tone that meant they were already planning which rules they could bend. They left the next morning at first light. Opal had packed carefully food for 4 days, her rifle and 2 boxes of shells, the documents she already had pertaining to the land, her good dress for the meetings with Bellamy, and a change of clothes for each of the boys. She had left water for the chickens and asked old Jonah's teller at the neighboring property to keep an eye on the place, which was all she could do. Clarence had spent the previous day repairing the broken section of fence on the north side of her property, unrequested. She had watched him do it from the kitchen window, and when he came in for supper she did not mention it, and he did not mention it either, and somehow the absence of comment was its own kind of thing. They rode the first morning mostly in silence. Thomas chattered for a while and then was overcome by the monotony of the plains and fell asleep propped against Eli on the wagon seat. Opal drove the wagon and Clarence rode alongside on his roan horse, and after a while the silence became comfortable in the way that silences between people who respect each other can become comfortable. "How long were you married?" Clarence asked when they were an hour out. Opal glanced at him. He was not looking at her, watching the road ahead with the steady scan of a man accustomed to watching for things. 8 years, she said, though the last 2 were hard. Fever takes people quickly, he said. Sometimes. With Emmett it was 4 days. There was nothing to be done. I am sorry. It was a long time ago, Opal said, which was true in terms of years and not particularly true in any other way. Another mile passed beneath the wheels. You managed the property yourself, he said, for 7 years. I did. That is a considerable thing. It did not feel considerable, Opal said. It felt necessary. There is a difference. He looked at her then, a quick sideways look, and she had the feeling she was being seen in some way she was not entirely accustomed to. Not assessed. Not valued for practical purposes, simply seen. Were there people who tried to help, he asked. Family, neighbors. My sister was in Missouri. She offered to take the boys, but I was not going to give up my sons any more than I was going to give up my land. Opal kept her eyes on the road. Emmett's brother came twice in the first year and offered to manage things for me. He was not a bad man, but his managing was the kind that ends with someone else's name on the deed. And the neighbors. Mostly good people. Jonah's teller and his wife Martha have been kind for years. There were others who helped when they could. But a widowed woman with 2 young children is a particular kind of problem for a community. You are either an object of charity or an opportunity, and neither of those felt like something I wanted to be. Clarence was quiet for a moment. So you just did it yourself? I just did it myself, Opal confirmed. He nodded slowly, looking at the road. I think I understand that, he said, and she believed him, though she did not ask why. They stopped at midday in a shallow wash where a line of cottonwoods provided shade, and Opal unpacked bread and dried meat in the canteen. Thomas had woken up and was full of questions about everything. The birds in the cottonwood trees, the red quality of the dirt in the wash, whether rattlesnakes could actually hear you coming. Clarence answered each question with a seriousness that Thomas clearly appreciated, though the seriousness was not without a dry humor that surfaced occasionally at the edges of his answers. Eli watched this with his arms crossed and said nothing. After they had eaten, Clarence walked the horses down to the water at the bottom of the wash to let them drink. Thomas followed him, peppering him with more questions. Eli stayed beside Opal. "I do not know why he is being so nice," Eli said quietly. "What do you mean?" "Men are usually nice because they want something." Opal looked at her 12-year-old son with the particular heartache of a mother who recognizes her own lessons being perfectly learned. She had taught him this. She had needed to teach him this. And it was right and it was useful, and it also broke something in her chest to hear it come out of his mouth in that flat, certain voice. "That is often true," she said carefully, "but not always. How do you know the difference?" She watched Clarence crouching by the water with Thomas, listening to whatever the boy was saying with what appeared to be genuine attention. "You keep watching," she said. "You do not decide too fast in either direction. You just keep watching." Eli said nothing, but she saw him turn to look at Clarence too. They made camp that night on the open plain, the kind of camp that was all practicality and no comfort. A small fire for cooking and warmth, blankets spread on the ground, the enormous Kansas sky wheeling overhead with its implausible density of stars. Opal made a simple supper over the fire, and Clarence unsaddled the horses and picketed them in the grass nearby. And by the time supper was ready, Thomas was already half asleep again, and Eli was yawning behind his hand. She got both boys settled and then sat by the fire with her coffee, and after a while Clarence came and sat on the other side of it. "Tell me about Dale Cutler," Opal said. Clarence stretched his legs toward the fire. "He came up from Texas about 5 years ago, made money in cattle first, then started diversifying. He has a lawyer in Dodge, a man named Prout, who seems to find interesting interpretations of property laws." "What kind of interesting interpretations?" "The kind that sometimes results in homesteaders discovering that their claims have a technical deficiency that was, coincidentally, just identified after they refused to sell." Opal felt the familiar cold tighten in her chest. "Has anyone challenged him legally?" "One family did. The Morrisons, out past the creek. They hired their own lawyer and went to the county court. It took 2 years and cost them most of what they had saved, and in the end Cutler dropped the claim before the final ruling, presumably because he had found an easier target." Clarence paused. "He is patient and he has money, and he does not need to win every fight. He just needs to win more than he loses." "What does he want with this land specifically? The land along this road is not particularly exceptional." "No," Clarence agreed. "But there is talk of a rail spur coming through this country in the next few years. If that happens, the land values change considerably." Opal absorbed this. She had heard the railroad rumors before, but had not connected them to Cutler's acquisitions. It was so obvious once she heard it said plainly that she felt briefly foolish for not having seen it herself. Then she let go of the foolishness, because there had been too many other things requiring her attention for 7 years to waste time feeling bad about what she had not had space to notice. "I will need to understand the legal situation with the Rhodes property clearly before I sign anything," she said, "even if the papers come from Frank Bellamy." "Especially if they come from Frank Bellamy," Clarence said, and when she looked at him sharply he added, "He is an honest man, but he is also a practical one. If there is a version of honest that costs him less trouble, he will choose it." Opal nodded. She could respect that kind of candor. The fire burned lower. On the other side of it, Thomas made a small sound in his sleep and shifted under his blanket, and Opal automatically turned to check, the way she had been turning to check on her boys in the dark for 9 and 12 years respectively, the vigilance that had become as natural as breathing. "You do not sleep much," Clarence observed. "I sleep when I know everything is all right," Opal said. "How often is everything all right?" She looked across the fire at him. He was watching her with that cedar-colored gaze that had the particular quality of seeing without pressing, and she found to her faint surprise that she did not mind being looked at in that way. "Less often than I would like," she said honestly. He nodded. "I will take the first watch," he said. "You should sleep. You have been riding 2 days." "I have," he said. "I am fine." "Sleep, Mrs. Rhodes." She wanted to argue with this on principle, because she did not take direction from strangers, and she certainly did not sleep under the protection of men she had known for 36 hours. But the fire was warm and the stars were steady overhead, and she was, in fact, more exhausted than she had admitted to herself, and something in the quality of his stillness, the absolute, unperformative steadiness of it, made her believe that the boys were safe. She lay down and pulled her blanket up and closed her eyes, and she heard him settle back against his saddle on the other side of the fire, and within a few minutes she was deeply, dreamlessly asleep for the first time in a very long while. She woke a few hours later and found him still awake, feeding small sticks to the fire. The night was deep and the plain was silent except for the wind and the distant sound of something moving in the grass. She lay still for a moment, watching him without making it known she was awake, and she noticed the way he sat, not tensely, not with the performance of vigilance, but with the genuine, quiet watchfulness of a man who was actually paying attention. She thought, "This is what my boys have not had." Not the dramatic, wide-shouldered presence of a man, which was not what any of them needed. But this specific thing, a person who sat up in the dark and watched and was genuinely attending to the safety of the camp, not for reward or recognition, but apparently because it was the right thing to do. She closed her eyes again and went back to sleep. Dodge City in 1882 was not the place it had been in its wildest years. The cattle drives were thinning as the railroads extended further south, and the town was making the slow, grinding transition from frontier outpost to something that aspired to respectability. But it still had enough of its old character to be brisk and loud and slightly dangerous at the edges. With the Boot Hill visible on the rise to the south, and the Long Branch Saloon still doing the kind of business that kept the cemetery in business. Opal had been to Dodge twice before, both times with Emmett, and she had not liked it particularly on either occasion. Now she drove the wagon down Front Street with her boys on the seat beside her and Clarence riding alongside, and she was aware of the looks that followed them. A lone woman on a wagon with 2 children, unremarkable on its own but somehow conspicuous in the way that a woman who carried herself with absolute self-possession could be conspicuous in places that were not accustomed to it. They found rooms at a respectable boarding house on Walnut Street, Mrs. Porter's place, which Bellamy had recommended. Opal took a room with the boys and Clarence took the adjacent room, and the boarding house was clean and quiet and served decent meals, and Opal allowed herself to feel briefly, cautiously comfortable. Frank Bellamy's office was on 2nd Avenue, above a hardware store. He was a stocky man in his 50s with silver hair, and the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of dealing with people who wanted things he was not sure he could deliver. He greeted Opal with genuine warmth, and she greeted him with professional courtesy, and they sat down on opposite sides of his desk like 2 people who respected each other's intelligence. The business of the land took the better part of 2 hours. Howard Greer had held a fractional interest in a small parcel at the northeast corner of the Rhodes property, a detail that had been written into the original partnership agreement between Emmett and Greer in 1871, and that Opal had not known about. With Greer's death intestate, the interest reverted, but there was a question of whether it reverted to the Rhodes estate or entered probate as part of Greer's holdings, in which case it could theoretically be purchased by a third party. "Cutler," Opal said. Bellamy looked uncomfortable. "His name has come up." "His name comes up everywhere lately," Opal said. "What do I need to do to make certain that interest stays with my property?" Bellamy explained the legal mechanisms available, and Opal listened carefully and asked questions that he did not seem to expect a widowed homesteader from the Kansas plain to ask, though he adapted to them with good grace. Clarence sat in the corner of the office and said almost nothing, but once or twice when Bellamy hesitated over a particular point, He said something brief and precise that moved the conversation forward in a useful direction, and Opal filed this away. They emerged from Bellamy's office 2 hours later with a set of papers that Opal needed to read fully before signing, a name of a Dodge City lawyer who could review them, and the information that Bellamy had, in fact, already been approached by a representative of Cutler regarding the Greer interest. He had declined to facilitate the approach, but had felt obligated to inform them of it. On the steps outside, Opal stopped and looked up at the hard blue sky above the rooftops of Dodge City and took a long breath. He came at this from 3 directions, she said. The Greer interest, the rumors about the rail spur, and whatever he was planning to do with his men visiting the property. Yes, Clarence said. He is not going to stop. No, Opal let out the long breath. Good, she said. Neither am I. They spent 2 days in Dodge, and Opal used those days as efficiently as she had used every other set of days in the past 7 years. She met with the lawyer, a careful young man named Harrison, who confirmed her reading of the documents and suggested 2 small amendments that Bellamy, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to. She signed the papers. She spoke to 2 other homesteaders in town who had been dealing with pressure from Cutler, and established that they were in contact with a 3rd family who was considering a collective legal complaint, which she filed away for future consideration. She visited the land office and examined the recorded plat maps for her section of the road with an attention that left the clerk visibly puzzled. Through all of this, Clarence was present. Not obtrusively, he did not insert himself, did not speak on her behalf, did not assume that his participation was required. He was simply there in the way that a trusted person can be there, available when useful and undemanding when not. He took the boys to the general store on the 2nd afternoon and let Thomas spend 20 minutes examining a display of bone-handled pocket knives, and then spent another 20 minutes explaining, with remarkable patience, why Thomas did not need a pocket knife and would not be getting one. Opal watched this from across the store and felt something move in her chest that she quickly identified and just as quickly told to settle down. But it did not entirely settle down. On the 2nd evening, after the boys were in bed, Opal came downstairs to find Clarence sitting on the front porch of the boarding house, watching the street. It was a warm evening and the town was still awake. She could hear the piano from the Long Branch a block away and the occasional sound of men's voices in the distance. She sat in the chair beside him. "You know what I cannot figure out," she said. "What is that? Why a man who was a deputy for 4 years and clearly knows how to read a legal situation is working as a courier." Clarence looked at the street. "I did not say I was only working as a courier." Opal waited. "I have been working with a group out of Wichita," he said. "They are building a legal case against some of the acquisition practices that have been used to dispossess homesteaders in this part of Kansas. It is slow work and it does not pay much, but it is worthwhile work." He paused. "Bellamy knows some of the people involved. When your situation came to his attention, he thought it might be relevant to our work." Opal absorbed this with the particular stillness she used when she was recalibrating. "So your visit was not purely a matter of delivering a package." Delivering the package was genuine. The rest of it, the Cutler information being available to escort you to Dodge, was also genuine. It just had more context than I initially offered. Why did you not tell me this from the start? Clarence looked at her directly. Because you had a rifle pointed at my chest, and I thought the full explanation might be better suited to a moment of lower stakes. Opal was quiet for a moment. Then very briefly she smiled. It was not a large smile, it was small and careful, the kind of smile that has learned to be economical, but it was real, and she felt it in the unfamiliar muscles of her face. "Fair point," she said. He smiled back just slightly, and the evening air between them had a quality she could not quite name. "What is the group in Wichita?" she asked. He told her in measured detail about the Citizens Land Association, a small, underfunded but increasingly organized effort to document and challenge the legal mechanisms being used to strip homesteaders, including many families who had established claims in good faith of their properties. Some of the families affected were white, like Opal. Others were black families who had come west after the war with enormous hope and were finding that the promises of the frontier were not extended to them with the same reliability. Clarence spoke about this last fact with a directness that told her it was not an abstraction to him. "You have seen it happen to people you know," she said. "My grandmother was born enslaved in Tennessee," he said, without fuss or drama. "She came west in 1866 with my grandfather and my father, who was 6 years old. They built something out of nothing in a part of Kansas where nothing was easy. I watched what happened to that land when my grandfather died, and there was suddenly an argument about whether certain parts of the deed were valid. He was quiet for a moment. We kept most of it, but we lost some of it. And I know what that cost the people who kept fighting." Opal said nothing. The piano from the long branch kept playing. "I am sorry," she said after a moment, "for what happened to your family." "Thank you," he said simply. "I am sorry for what you have been carrying for 7 years." She looked at him. He looked at her. The evening was warm and the stars were coming out above the rooftops of Dodge City, and for the first time in a very long time Opal Rhodes sat in the presence of another person and did not feel the need to be managing anything. They rode back to the homestead 3 days later, with the signed papers in Opal's satchel and a clearer picture of what she was up against and what resources she could draw on. Clarence had sent a wire to the Citizens Land Association in Wichita before they left, and had received a brief reply, indicating that the situation with the Rhodes property and the Cutler acquisitions was exactly the kind of pattern they had been documenting. The road home was easier in some ways. The business was done. The weather held. And Thomas had decided that Clarence was the finest man he had ever met, which expressed itself as an unceasing stream of conversation that Clarence handled with what could only be described as genuine enjoyment. Eli had relaxed by small increments throughout the trip, and on the second morning of the return journey, he rode his horse alongside Clarence for the better part of an hour, and they talked about horses, about their temperaments and their differences, about how to read a horse's mood from the set of its ears and the quality of its movement. And when Eli came back to ride beside the wagon, his face had an expression that was not quite open yet, but was further from closed than Opal had seen it in a long time. She ached with how much her sons needed this. She had done everything she could for them, everything, and she knew that a mother's everything was, in some specific ways, not enough. She had known this for years and had set it aside in the category of things she could not fix, and watching it sit up and make itself known was uncomfortable in the specific way that things you have carefully set aside can be uncomfortable. They arrived back at the homestead in the late afternoon of the 4th day. The property was undisturbed. Jonah's teller had done his duty by the chickens, and the fence Clarence had repaired on the north side was holding. Opal stood in her yard and looked at the house and the barn and the fields and felt the familiar mixture of pride and weariness and fierce, unconditional love for this specific piece of land that had been, for 7 years, the whole shape of her life. She turned to find Clarence unloading the wagon with efficient movements, setting bags on the porch, carrying the heaviest things without being asked. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, and kept doing it. She made supper and he stayed for it, and after supper he sat at the kitchen table while she and the boys did the evening chores, and when she came back in he had washed the dishes, which was such an unexpected thing that she stood in the kitchen doorway and stared at the clean dishes on the rack for a moment without speaking. "I should get back on the road," he said. "I have a report to get to Wichita." "You could stay the night and start fresh in the morning," Opal said, and then immediately wondered at herself for saying it. He looked at her. "I could do that," he said. "The barn," she clarified quickly. "Of course," he said, with a straight face that had something just behind the straightness. He left in the morning as the first light was coming up, and Opal stood on the porch and watched him ride out, and she noticed that she watched him until he was a small dark shape against the pale grass and then gone, and she noticed that she kept standing on the porch for a while after that with her coffee going cold in her hand. He came back 3 weeks later. He rode up in the afternoon this time, in full daylight, and called out his name from the end of the lane so there would be no repeat of the first morning standoff. She was in the garden when she heard him and straightened up and pushed her hair back from her face and walked to the fence, and she was aware in a way she could not have been 3 weeks ago that the sight of him coming up her lane was something she was glad about. He had papers from the Citizens Land Association. He had information about 2 additional homesteaders who were willing to join a collective action against Cutler's acquisition practices. He had a letter from the lawyer Harrison in Dodge with a further recommendation regarding the Greer interest. These were all legitimate reasons to have ridden 2 days, and Opal reviewed all of them seriously and with genuine appreciation. But he also stayed for supper, and he helped Thomas with the arithmetic that was giving the boy trouble. And he told Eli, who had been asking around about learning to rope properly, that he knew something about it and would be willing to show him, which led to the 2 of them in the yard after supper with a length of rope and the fence post as a target, and the sound of Eli's genuine, uncomplicated laughter when he finally got the loop right was something Opal heard from the kitchen window and held very still to listen to, because she had not heard that sound from her elder son in longer than she could say. He stayed 2 days that time. When he left, Thomas cried, which Thomas would have been mortified to know that Opal had seen, and Eli did not cry but stood in the yard and watched the roan horse until it was gone with an expression that said the same thing in a different language. He came back a month after that, and again 6 weeks later. And each time there was genuine business. The collective legal action was proceeding, and Opal had become one of its more engaged participants, writing letters to the county land office and corresponding with 2 women in Wichita who were organizing on similar issues. But each time there was also the supper, and the evenings on the porch, and the conversations that had become the thing she found herself looking forward to with an honesty she was no longer entirely able to suppress. They talked about everything: the legal situation which was progressing, the railroad rumors which were solidifying. There was now strong indication that a spur line would come through within 5 years, which changed the stakes on the land considerably. The history of the country they were living in, which neither of them was willing to look at through a simplifying lens. The boys, she talked about her sons with Clarence in a way she had not talked about them with anyone since Emmett. The specific combination of love and worry and fierce pride that was the particular experience of raising children alone. He talked about his own history. His grandmother, who had died when he was 14, and who had known things about endurance that most people never had to learn. His father, who had rebuilt after the losses of the land dispute, and who was still working that Kansas soil at 61. His years as a deputy, which had taught him things about the machinery of law and power that still shaped how he moved through the world. The work with the Citizens Land Association, which he believed in deeply and which was slowly, imperfectly, doing something real. One evening in October, with the air gone cool and the plains taking on the particular gold of the fall light, they were sitting on the porch after the boys had gone to bed, and Opal was looking at the stars and thinking about something he had said earlier about the next stage of the legal case, and she said, without particularly planning to say it, "I have not let myself want things in a long time." Clarence looked at her. Personal things, she clarified, because she did not want him to think she was talking about the land case or the legal strategy. Things that are just for me. What kinds of things? He asked, and his voice had a quality of carefulness that was not caution but something more like attentiveness. She thought about how to say it. She was not a woman who had ever had much patience for indirection, but this was new territory and she was navigating it with the same care she gave to anything that mattered. "I have spent 7 years building a wall," she said. "A good wall. a necessary wall. It has kept my son safe and my land intact and my dignity whole. But a wall that keeps everything out also keeps you inside of it. And there have been times when I could not remember what it felt like to be inside something rather than outside of everything. Clarence was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass, and somewhere out on the plain a coyote called and was answered. "I do not want to come through a wall uninvited," he said carefully. Opal looked at him directly. "I am telling you that the door is there," she said. "I am not saying where the door is or what it looks like. I am just telling you it exists." He looked at her for a long moment with those cedar-colored eyes, and she had the feeling of being seen all the way to the back of herself. And for the first time in a very long time that feeling did not make her want to step away. "All right," he said. "I will look for the door." He found it in November. He arrived on a gray November afternoon with the first real cold of the season in the air, and he came not with papers or news about the legal case, but with a question. He found her stacking wood behind the barn and stood where she could see him clearly and said, "I would like to court you properly, if you are willing. I am not asking for anything you are not ready to give, and I am not going to pretend that I do not understand what you have built here and why. But I would like to be honest about what I am hoping for, if you will let me." Opal set down the piece of wood in her hands. She looked at this man who had ridden up her lane in the dark 6 months ago, and whom she had nearly shot, and who had, in the interim, repaired her fence, and helped her son learn to laugh again, and sat up in the dark watching over her camp and washed her dishes without being asked, and treated her legal situation as something worthy of serious attention, and treated her sons like people whose inner lives mattered. "I am willing," she said. His face did something that was not quite a smile, but was better than a smile. It was the face of a man who has been hoping for something and has just been given it, and the simplicity and genuineness of it made her chest ache in a warm way. "Good," he said. They courted through the winter with the particular gravity and care of two people who were old enough to know what they were doing and why it mattered. He came every 2 to 3 weeks, and Opal allowed herself, gradually and with deliberate intention, to take down some of the wall, not all of it, not quickly, but in the way that things that are built over years come down, carefully, piece by piece, with attention given to what was structurally necessary and what had become, over time, a kind of armor that was no longer serving its original purpose. He held her hand on the porch one evening in December, and it was such a simple thing that it should not have mattered as much as it did, and it mattered more than almost anything had in 7 years. He kissed her in January, at the end of a visit, on her porch in the cold afternoon light, with the plain stretching out white and frozen behind him, and both of them aware that the boys were inside the house and could be watching from the window. It was brief and careful and honest, and she stood in the cold after he had ridden away and put her hand to her own face and felt the warmth there and thought, oh, she was 37 years old and she had thought she was past this. Not past wanting. She was too clear-eyed about herself to have believed that entirely, but past the specific vulnerability of it. The way love's approach makes the inside of your chest feel like new country you do not entirely know how to navigate. She had thought the 7 years had permanently mapped her interior, that she knew all her own geography. And here was Clarence Stone, quiet and careful and steady, walking around in unmapped territory she apparently still had. Eli asked her about it in February. He was 12, almost 13, and sharp as broken glass, and he had been watching for months with those watchful eyes of his. "Is Mr. Stone going to be here permanently?" he asked one morning at breakfast, in the careful neutral tone he used when he was working up to something bigger. Opal set down her coffee cup. "Why do you ask?" "I am trying to understand what to expect," Eli said, with a candor that was so like her own that she felt briefly disoriented. "I do not want to get used to something that is going to go away." Opal looked at her son, this boy who had spent 7 years learning not to count on things, not because she had failed him, but because the world had educated him prematurely in the cost of counting on things. She thought about what she owed him, which was the truth delivered as gently as possible. "I do not know exactly what the future looks like," she said, "but I can tell you that Mr. Stone is not the kind of person who disappears. That much I know." Eli turned this over. "Do you like him?" "I do. More than just like," Opal breathed. "That is between me and Mr. Stone," she said, and then, because this was Eli and he deserved better than evasion, "Yes, more than just like." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He is all right, I think," and went back to his breakfast, which was, from Eli, the highest possible endorsement. Thomas, when he found out, and he found out because Thomas found out everything, produced a whoop of pure happiness that could be heard from the barn, and came running into the kitchen to announce that he had known all along, and that he thought Mr. Stone was the best man he had ever met, and could he come to live with them now. "Thomas," Opal said firmly. "Yes, Mama," Thomas said, and grinned. The spring of 1883 brought two things that changed everything. The first was the legal ruling. The Citizens Land Association's collective action, which had been building for months, came to a partial but significant resolution in March, when the county court ruled that two of Cutler's acquisition methods had been procedurally improper. The ruling did not undo all of the acquisitions, but it established a precedent that made the remaining ones considerably more legally precarious, and it effectively put a stop to new approaches along the road. Cutler's lawyer Prout filed an immediate appeal, but the legal landscape had shifted enough that the immediate threat to the Rhodes property was substantially reduced. Opal received the news by letter and read it 3 times sitting at her kitchen table, and then went outside and stood in her yard and let herself feel, for a moment, the exhausted, disbelieving relief of a person who has been braced for a fight for so long that not having to fight feels strange. The second thing was simpler and more personal. Clarence came in March, and they walked the fence line together in the late afternoon, as they had gotten in the habit of doing, going over the property with the comfortable familiarity of two people who know a piece of land jointly, even if only one of them holds the deed. The cottonwoods along the North Creek were just budding out, small and precise green against the gray sky, and the grass was beginning to show the first faint green of spring beneath the pale dead winter growth. They stopped at the top of the low rise at the east side of the property, where the whole homestead was visible, the house and the barn and the garden and the fields, the fence lines running out in each direction, the lane coming up from the road where Opal had stood with her rifle in the dark 6 months ago and demanded to know who was coming. "I have been thinking," Clarence said. "About what?" "About whether the work I do could be done as well or better from a place instead of from the road." He was looking at the homestead below them and not at her, and she could see the careful deliberateness of this. "I have been talking to the association about establishing an office in this part of Kansas. It would mean being based somewhere rather than riding constantly." Opal looked at the property too. "Somewhere," she said. "Somewhere," he agreed. Then, after a moment, "Here specifically if you would have me." She turned to look at him. He turned to look at her, and in the spring light with the budding cottonwoods behind him he looked like a man who had brought everything he had and was offering it without negotiation. "That is a large thing to ask," she said. "I know," he said. "I have a specific way of asking it that I hoped might be acceptable." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a small ring gold, with a small setting that caught the gray light, simple and well-made. He held it in his palm without theatrics. "Opal Rhodes," he said, "I have been watching you for 7 months, and I have never seen anything that made me more certain of what I wanted to do for the rest of my life than watching you run your property and raise your sons and take on Dale Cutler and his lawyers with nothing but your own intelligence and determination. I am not asking you to need me. I know you do not need me. I am asking you to choose me anyway. That is all." Opal looked at the ring in his palm. She looked at his face. She looked at the homestead below them, the thing she had built and defended and refused to give up, the physical embodiment of 7 years of unassisted determination. "My sons would need to be part of this," she said. not as an afterthought, as central. "I know," he said. "I would not want it any other way." "Eli is going to have conditions," she said with a faint and genuine smile. "I expect he will. I am prepared to negotiate." Opal reached out and picked up the ring from his palm. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was slight and real and honest, like the man who had offered it. "Yes," she said, "I choose you." He smiled then, the full, unguarded smile she had seen only rarely, the one that made him look like the man he was when no one was requiring him to be careful. And he put the ring on her finger and then took her hand and held it. And they stood on the rise above the homestead together in the spring light and looked at it together. And she thought that this was the first time in 7 years that she had looked at the place she had built, without also carrying the weight of being the only thing standing between it and the world. They told the boys that evening. Thomas's response was immediate and vocal and involved running in circles around the kitchen, which was not dignified but was so thoroughly genuine that even Eli's composure cracked and he laughed. Eli, when the initial chaos subsided, came to Clarence and held out his hand with a formality that was entirely his own and said, "I have conditions." Clarence shook the hand with equivalent formality. "I imagined you might. Let's hear them." "You do not replace my father," Eli said. "Nobody does. But you can be something different, something else. I just needed to say that first." Clarence nodded. "That is right and I respect it. Your father was your father. I have not come here to be anything other than what I am." Eli looked at him for a long moment with those assessing eyes. "The second condition is that if you ever hurt my mother, I will not forget it." "That is fair," Clarence said. "I hope to give you no cause to remember it." Eli extended his hand again, and Clarence shook it again, and something passed between them that was not dramatic, but was real, a negotiated, honest truce that had the possibility of becoming something more than a truce over time. They were married in June of 1883, in a small ceremony on the homestead with Jonas and Martha Teller, and a handful of neighbors in attendance, and the Reverend Hawkins from the church in Larne presiding. Opal wore her good dress and a cream-colored ribbon in her hair that Martha Teller had brought without being asked, and Clarence wore his good coat and looked at Opal during the ceremony with an expression that required no interpretation. The boys stood up with them, Thomas vibrating with excitement, and Eli composed and serious and present, in a way that Opal would remember for the rest of her life. They said their vows in the yard with the spring prairie all around them and the sky enormous and blue overhead. And when Hawkins pronounced them married and Clarence kissed her gently in front of their small gathered community, Opal felt the wall, that 7 years of careful, necessary wall, let go of its last piece, and she stood in its absence and found, to her own mild astonishment, that she was not afraid. The summer and fall of 1883 were the first time in 7 years that Opal Rhodes moved through her days without the constant underlying tension of a person bracing for the next problem to manage alone. This was not because the problem stopped. Clarence's presence did not magic away difficulty. The legal appeal from Cutler was still working its way through the courts. There was a drought in July that hurt the corn, and Thomas broke his wrist falling from the hayloft in August and required several weeks of being carried everywhere he went, which he found glorifying and which drove Eli to distraction. Life was still the particular combination of hard and beautiful that prairie life was, but the problems were shared now. Clarence worked the land with her, learning it, the way a person who has come to something late learns it with the attention of someone who knows the value of what they are being given. He was not a farmer by formation, but he was a man who knew how to work and how to learn, and he brought to the homestead the same quiet, genuine attention he had brought to everything else she had observed him do. He also brought his work with the Citizens' Land Association, which he ran from the small room off the kitchen that they had converted to an office. The legal work continued, and Opal found herself increasingly involved in it, not just as a subject but as an active participant, writing letters, organizing correspondence with other homesteaders, eventually traveling twice to Wichita to speak with the association's lawyers directly. The appeal from Cutler's team was heard in the fall of 1883 and was denied, which meant the original ruling stood, and Opal received this news in Clarence's arms on the porch with the autumn light going golden over the plains. And she cried a little, which she had not done in front of anyone in years, and he held her and said nothing, which was exactly right. Eli turned 13 that autumn and was growing into himself with a speed that was dizzying, getting taller, getting broader through the shoulders, losing some of the wariness around Clarence, and replacing it with something that was beginning, cautiously, to look like affection. He was working alongside Clarence in the evenings on mathematics, because it turned out Clarence had a genuine facility with numbers and Eli had ambitions about what he wanted to do with his education. They spent hours at the kitchen table with a lamp between them, and Opal sometimes sat nearby with her sewing and listened to them talk, and the domestic ordinariness of this particular scene was something so far from her experience of the previous 7 years that it sometimes still caught her by surprise. Thomas recovered from his broken wrist and declared that the experience had given him character. He was 10 now, endlessly curious and energetic, and had adopted Clarence with the wholehearted completeness of a child who has made a decision and is not interested in doubting it. He called him by his given name, which Clarence had invited, and followed him around the property asking questions and offering opinions and occasionally making observations that were so accurate that they stopped the adults in their tracks. One evening in late October, after the boys were in bed and the fire was burning low and Clarence had put down the papers he was working on and come to sit beside her on the settle, Opal said, "I want to tell you something." "All right," he said, in the way he had of making it easy to say things. "When you rode up my lane last March with your hands up," she said, "I was looking at you over the barrel of that rifle, and I was doing the thing I always did, reading you for the thing you were after, because every man who came up that lane was after something. And I was good at it. I had gotten very good at it." She looked at the fire. "I could not read you. I could not find the thing you were after in the way I expected to find it, and I did not know what to make of that." "What did you make of it eventually?" he asked. "That the thing you were after was not a thing," she said. "It was a person." And that was something I had not prepared for. Clarence was quiet for a moment. "I was not after anything," he said. "Not at first. I was just doing a job. But then I met you and I watched you for 5 minutes and I thought, this is someone I want to know. And that was not a plan or a strategy. It just happened." Opal leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she was still learning to do, the simple physical expression of trust that her body had forgotten the grammar of over 7 years. He put his arm around her, and she felt the solidity and warmth of him, and the fire burned, and the prairie was quiet and dark outside. "I am glad you came up my lane," she said. "So am I," he said. "Even accounting for the rifle," she laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came from deep and real, the kind that uses the whole chest, and Clarence felt it against his side and said nothing, just tightened his arm around her a little, and she thought, "This is what I did not know I was missing. This specifically. Not a man, not a helpmate, not a protector, just this particular warmth of being known and held and safe within the holding." The winter of 1883 into 1884 was cold and hard and beautiful, the way Kansas winters could be when they were serious about themselves. Snow that came in on the north wind and stayed, and the plains turned a white so complete it made the sky look gray by comparison, and the house was warm and full, and the evenings were long. In the new year, Opal discovered she was expecting. She sat with this knowledge for a week before she told anyone, not from reluctance, but from the particular privacy of the first days of knowing something that is not yet real enough to share. She had been here before, twice, the specific internal knowing that precedes all outward evidence. But it had been 10 years since the last time, and she was 38, and she allowed herself the week of quiet to understand how she felt about it. She felt glad. That was ultimately the shape of it. She felt glad. She told Clarence on a Saturday evening after the boys were in bed. She sat across the table from him with her hands folded on the surface and said, "There is going to be another member of this household." He was very still for a moment. Then he looked up at her with an expression that she would remember with exactness for the rest of her life, a kind of stunned, wide-open gladness that he was not trying to contain. "Are you certain?" "I am quite certain," she said. He came around the table and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then held her against him, and she could feel the deep, real quality of the feeling in him, not performed happiness but actual happiness, uncomplicated and warm. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Old," she said honestly, "and glad, in that order." He laughed and held her tighter, and she thought that this, too, was a kind of miracle to be 38 years old and feel not past things but still in them, still beginning things. They told the boys the next morning. Thomas's reaction was immediate, profound, and lasted approximately 4 minutes before he started negotiating for the right to name the baby. Eli was quiet for a long time, and Opal watched him doing the internal work of adding this to his map of the world, and then he looked up with a smile that was smaller than Thomas's but more considered. "Is it going to be a girl?" he asked. "We do not know," Opal said. "I think it will be a boy," Eli said, "and I think we should name him John." "That is very specific for someone who says he does not know," Opal observed. "I am often right," Eli said, with a composure that was so like her own that she had to look away to keep from laughing. The spring of 1884 was the most fully alive Opal had felt in a decade. The land was coming out of winter with its usual brutal optimism. The legal situation was largely resolved. The homestead was secure in a way it had not been for years, and the particular warmth of a house with people in it who had chosen each other was something she was still learning to inhabit. Clarence had deepened his roots by this point, working the land in the mornings, doing his association work in the afternoons, and in the evenings being as fully present in the life of the family as if he had always been part of it. The boys had stopped thinking of him as someone who had arrived. He was simply there, in the way that necessary things become part of the landscape. He taught Eli to shoot properly, which was a conversation between the three of them, Opal, Clarence, and Eli, that was serious and honest and took account of Eli's existing capability and added to it rigorously. He taught Thomas how to read a horse's health from its coat and its movement and its appetite, which was information Thomas deployed immediately and at length on every horse he encountered for the next several months. He fixed the south wall of the barn, which had been slowly losing a battle with weather for years, and built shelves in the kitchen pantry that Opal had been planning to build herself for 3 years without finding the time. And he sat with her in the evenings, and they talked or read or simply occupied the same room in the contented parallel way that two people can occupy a space when they are not performing anything for each other, when they are simply being. On an afternoon in April, with the plains green and the sky very blue, Opal stood at the edge of the north field and looked at the property she had held for 7 years by herself, and then looked at the house where Clarence was working in his office, and where, inside, she could hear the faint sounds of Thomas doing something inadvisable, and she thought about the particular nature of what she had built. She had built something out of necessity and kept it by will, and expanded it by intelligence, and now was, for the first time, sharing it by choice. Not because she had needed to, she was very clear about this, as she was clear about most things, but because she had chosen to let someone in. One person, after 7 years of keeping the world at a carefully maintained distance. Just this one, and the choice had turned out to be the right one. She had not expected to be right. She had not expected much at all, that morning in the dark with the Winchester against her shoulder. She had expected to make a determination, and take the appropriate action, and then get back to the 1,000 other things that required her attention. She had not expected the determination to end in a man sitting on her porch steps with his hat in his hands, telling her the door was there to find. She walked back to the house in the warm afternoon light. Jonas had come by that morning with Martha, and Martha had brought a pie and had sat in Opal's kitchen and talked with the easy, unself-conscious warmth of a woman who has known you through hard times and is glad to see you in better ones. Jonas had brought some news from further up the road. The Morrisons had finally settled their remaining land dispute and were staying, which was good. One of the other families that had been under pressure from Cutler had relocated, which was a loss, but Opal had heard from them by letter, and they had found good land further north and were doing all right. The web of things was what it was, not clean, not perfectly resolved, with injustices that had not been undone and wrongs that had not been righted. But there was the ruling, and there was the association's ongoing work, and there was the simple, unglamorous fact that Opal Rhodes had not given up her land, and that the women in Wichita were still organizing, and that the legal mechanisms that had been used against homesteaders were now documented and challenged in court. Things moved slowly, but they moved. The baby came in September of 1884, in the room where both of Opal's boys had been born, with Martha Teller serving as the midwife she had always served as, and Clarence waiting in the kitchen in a state of controlled but genuine tension that Thomas watched with fascinated attention. It was a boy. Eli, when he was told, said simply, "I knew it," with a composure that was entirely undermined by the fact that he was smiling so widely it looked like it might crack his face. Thomas immediately began the campaign to name the baby John, which had been Eli's suggestion, and which Thomas had adopted entirely as his own. The baby's name was John Emmett Stone, and he arrived with dark hair and the particular furious indignation of a person who had been perfectly comfortable where he was, and was not impressed by the change in circumstances. Opal held him in the September afternoon light and felt the weight of him, so specific, so entirely real, and looked up to find Clarence in the doorway, his face undone with a feeling too large for composure. He came and sat beside her and looked at his son, and then looked at her and she looked at him, and there was no need for words, which was perhaps the most complete form of communication available. "Hello, John Emmett Stone," Clarence said quietly. The baby expressed an opinion about this that was not entirely positive. "He is testing you already," Opal said. "I expected nothing less from your child," Clarence said. Eli and Thomas were admitted, and Eli held the baby with the exaggerated caution of someone terrified of breaking something important, and Thomas held him with slightly too much confidence, and had to be reminded twice to support the head, and John Emmett Stone regarded both of his brothers with the ancient, unimpressed scrutiny of the very newly born. Outside, the prairie was golden in the late September light, the grass turning, the sky going that particular deep blue of the Kansas autumn. The house was full of voices and warmth, and the particular, ordinary, irreplaceable texture of a family's ordinary afternoon. In the weeks after John's arrival, Opal moved through the changed landscape of her days with a kind of wondering attention. The baby was new and demanding in all the ways that babies are, and she was 38 and not exactly sprightly, and some days were very hard, and on those days Clarence was there, actually, practically there, doing the things that needed doing without commentary or complaint, getting up in the night when she was too exhausted, keeping the boys occupied when she needed quiet, making sure she ate and slept in the basic, necessary ways that people can forget to do when they are carrying too much. She watched him be a father, the careful, attentive, deeply engaged quality he brought to it, and thought again about what she had let in. One person after 7 years. She had not been looking for a man to come and save her. She had not been looking at all, but she had been found nonetheless, and the finding had turned out to be not the loss of herself she had feared, but an expansion of what she was, more room, not less, more warmth, not the loss of the cold clarity that had kept her alive and whole. By the time John was 3 months old, his brothers were completely devoted to him. Eli, who had spent years being responsible and watchful, discovered in his infant brother an entirely uncomplicated outlet for tenderness. He would sit for long periods just holding the baby, talking quietly to him, with an expression of peaceful concentration that made Opal's heart swell every time she saw it. Thomas, predictably, tried to teach John things that John was physically incapable of learning for several more years, and had to be repeatedly redirected. But the love behind the attempts was so obvious and complete that even the redirections were affectionate. The spring of 1885 brought the confirmed news of the rail spur. The line was coming through, as the rumors had been saying, and it would pass within 4 miles of the Rhodes homestead. The land values along that road were going to change substantially. Cutler had acquired several properties along it, but not the Rhodes land, and the legal ruling from 1883 had held through the appeal. What Opal stood to gain from the increased land value was not a fortune, but it was meaningful enough to properly fund the children's education, enough to add the second barn that had been on the wish list for years, enough to feel the genuine, material confirmation that the 7 years of holding on had been worth it. She sat on the porch one evening in April, with John on her lap and Eli and Thomas doing their evening chores in the yard and Clarence on the step beside her reading through a document from the association, and she looked out at the land, her land, their land, the specific 160 acres that had contained and shaped her entire adult life, and she thought about what Emmett would have made of this. He would have been glad for the boys, she thought. He had been a man who loved his sons with an unambiguous completeness, and he would have been glad to see them as they were. Eli serious and capable and beginning to talk about studying law, and Thomas endlessly alive and questioning, and full of a generous curiosity about the world that Opal suspected was going to take him somewhere interesting. And the new baby, who had Emmett's dark hair and Clarence's steady gaze, and something of his own that was entirely himself. She thought Emmett would have been glad for her too. Whatever had been difficult between them in those last years, the hardness of early homesteading, the fatigue, the dreams not yet made real, he had been a man who wanted good things for her, and she thought he would have recognized Clarence Stone as a good thing and been glad. She opened the wooden box that night after everyone was asleep and read Emmett's letter for the 4th time since the package had arrived. It was brief and carried the particular quality of something written by a man who did not yet know he was dying, full of plans, full of the assumption of future, full of the unself-conscious confidence of someone who has not yet received the information that changes everything. He had written it shortly before the fever came. She folded it carefully and put it back. She kept the box on the shelf in the bedroom where she could see it, and she thought that this was right, not hidden, not obsessively consulted, just present in the way that the past is present. Part of the room, part of the story, not competing with the present but contextualizing it. The summer and fall of 1885 settled into the rhythms of a life that was working. John learned to walk in August with a wobbling determination that reduced the entire household to undignified expressions of delight. Eli began corresponding with a law college in Kansas City that had written to the Citizens Land Association about potential students with demonstrated interest in land law, which had come about through Clarence's connections, though Clarence was careful to present it as an opportunity that Eli's own work had earned, which was true. Thomas had become the property's unofficial veterinarian and was currently nursing a lame horse back to health with a seriousness of purpose that had impressed even old Jonah's teller, who was not easily impressed. The legal work continued. The association had grown, and the collective actions had produced results that were not everything, but were something: documented injustices made visible, legal precedents established, some families who had been on the verge of losing their properties still holding them. It was not the clean resolution of a story. It was the messy, incomplete, continuing work of building something fairer out of materials that had been gathered under unfair conditions, and Opal and Clarence were both too honest to pretend it was otherwise. But there was the land. There was the house and the barn and the fields, secure now in a way they had not been for years, the deed unambiguous, the challenge defeated, the future of the Rhodes homestead no longer a daily contest of will and vigilance. There were the boys, who were thriving in their entirely individual ways, each of them becoming, before their parents' eyes, the particular version of themselves that had been waiting in the material of who they were all along. There was John, who was the living, concrete evidence that the second half of a life could hold as much as the first, and more, and different. And there was Clarence, who had come up her lane in the dark and not been shot, and had found the door she told him to look for, and had come through it quietly and completely, and taken up residence in her life, and in her heart in a way that she had not expected and could not now imagine being without. On an evening in October of 1885, they sat on the porch together after a long day, John asleep inside, Eli at the kitchen table writing letters, Thomas long since collapsed into bed after a day of physical activity that would have felled a smaller person. And the harvest was in, and the grass was going gold, and the sky was enormous and dark, and full of the particular density of stars that the Kansas plain, this far from any town, still offered up with improbable generosity. Opal was quiet for a while, then she said, "I want to tell you something." "All right," he said, in the way he always said it. "There was a point, I think it was around the second winter alone, so 1877, when I made a decision," she said. "I decided that what I was going to be was the wall, not a person behind the wall itself, because I thought that was the only way to make certain the boys were safe and the land was held and nothing else got taken from me." Clarence listened, watching the stars. "I got very good at being the wall," Opal said. "I am not sorry for it. It worked. It kept everything intact that needed to be kept intact." She paused. "But I forgot, somewhere in there, that a wall is a means and not an end. I lost track of what the wall was supposed to be protecting." Clarence was quiet for a moment. What was it protecting? Opal turned to look at him. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his face was clear and open and entirely present, the face of a man who had given her all 7 years of patient, consistent attention and was still, right now, entirely attentive. "Me," she said. "It was supposed to be protecting me." He reached across the settle and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat in the October dark with the whole prairie around them and the stars above, and the house warm and full at their backs. "It did a good job," he said. "It did," she agreed. "And then it let you in." He raised her hand and kissed the back of it, which he had done before but which never failed to produce the warmth she associated, now and always, with being genuinely known. "I will try to be worth the exception," he said. "You already are," she said simply. The wind moved through the dry grass on the south side of the property, with a sound that was the oldest and most constant thing in the world, older than the houses, older than the fences, older than the claims and the deeds and the legal arguments, older than any of the human dramas played out on the face of this land. And Opal Rhodes sat with her husband in the October dark, and felt the specific warmth of a life that had become, against all reasonable expectation, exactly what she had needed it to be. Not what she had planned. She had not planned any of this. She had planned to survive, and she had done that, and in the surviving she had become something harder and stronger and more capable than the young woman who had stood at Emmett's graveside in the spring of 1875 with 2 small children and 160 acres of Kansas plain, and the absolute bedrock determination not to let it break her. It had not broken her. It had made her. And then, when she had been made and the wall was fully built, and she was standing inside it doing the work of her life with full capability, then the door had opened, and the world had sent her this particular man, and she had looked at him over a rifle barrel and made a determination. She had determined correctly. Inside the house, John made a small sound in his sleep, the half-waking murmur of a baby dreaming, and Opal turned her head automatically toward it and listened, and it subsided, and she turned back to the stars. Clarence's hand was warm in hers. The fire in the house cast a faint orange light through the window. Eli's lamp was still burning on the kitchen table, and she could hear the faint scratch of his pen on paper. Her serious, brilliant older son, writing letters about land law at 13, becoming the man he was going to be. Thomas would sleep until the house burned down around him once he was out, which he was. And John would wake at 2 in the morning and be astonished by this fact, as he was every night, as if the darkness were new each time. And Clarence would be there in the morning, and the morning after that, and all the mornings that were coming down the road like the horizon that kept receding and arriving in front of you on the Kansas plain, never reached but always there, always real. Opal Rhodes looked at the stars for a long time, and she was, in the most full and private sense of the word, at peace.